The wagon wheels groaned against the rocky mountain path, each jolt echoing up her spine. She clutched her small black bonnet in her lap, fingers twisted so tight the knuckles looked bloodless. The driver never looked back, his shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on the winding trail that disappeared into the dark pines. At the end of the trail stood a house, rough logs stacked high, dark roof slicing the sky. He waited on the porch, a tall man with a heavy coat and gray streaks in his hair, his face pale and marked with deep, silent lines. He did not move as she stepped down, did not reach to help. Instead, his eyes pinned her in place, cold and unreadable. The wagon turned at once, rolling away with a sharp crack of the whip. She watched it disappear, dust spiraling behind it like a last breath. The man's boots shifted on the frost-bitten boards. She forced herself to move, feet numb, her trunk heavy in her grip. She set it down near the steps. He didn't speak, only turned and pushed the door open. The sound, wood against wood, felt final, a heavy seal slamming shut. She hesitated on the threshold, the wind curling around her ankles. The hallway beyond was dark, a thin line of lamplight cutting across the floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing louder than the creak of the boards. When she finally crossed inside, he closed the door behind her. The cold was gone, but a different chill settled on her skin. In that moment, she realized she was no longer a guest. She was property. That first night, he led her to the east room without a word. The hall felt like a throat closing around her, each step swallowed by the heavy darkness. The room was small, a narrow bed with a wool blanket, a chipped basin on a crooked table, and a single oil lamp sputtering in the corner. He pointed at the floor, his finger firm and unwavering. She understood. No shoes inside, no wandering. Her place was here, and here alone. He stood in the doorway, outlined by the weak glow from the hall. His eyes swept over her, not with warmth or curiosity, but with the cold calculation of a farmer examining stock. Then he turned and left, shutting the door with a slow, deliberate drag that made her heart clench. She sat on the edge of the bed, bonnet in her lap, her breath shallow and uneven. The walls seemed to lean inward, the shadows crawling along the floor like silent dogs. Every creak of the house above and around her felt like a hand tapping her shoulder. In that silence, the rules began to settle around her like a second skin. Rise before dawn, no questions, no noise, never open the western door. Obedience was not expected. It was demanded. She set the bonnet on the table and pressed her forehead to her knees, her hands gripping the thin wool of her dress. Outside, the wind rattled against the walls, as if trying to claw its way inside. That night, in the stifling dark, she understood that nothing here belonged to her, not even her own voice. At first light, she heard the floorboards groan outside her door. She rose quickly, fingers fumbling at the buttons on her dress, her hair rough and unpinned. When she stepped into the hallway, the house felt colder than the night before. In the kitchen, she saw the maid for the first time, a thin woman with hollow cheeks and restless eyes that never stayed in one place. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight knot, her hands red and raw from endless scrubbing. The maid glanced at her only once, then looked away as though afraid to be caught breathing the same air. A crippled ranch hand appeared near the back door, limping heavily as he carried a pail of water. His shoulders hunched inward, and he avoided her gaze completely, as if she were an empty chair. When the tall man entered, both of them stiffened at once. The maid's hands shook, water sloshed from a tin cup onto the floor, but she did not speak. He crossed the kitchen without acknowledging her presence, his boots thudding like muted hammers. The room seemed to shrink, air thickening around her throat. The maid wiped the spilled water in quick, frightened strokes, head bowed so low her hair nearly touched the floor. No one introduced her. No words were shared. The quiet felt more violent than a slap. She stood near the doorway, her bonnet pressed to her ribs, her breath shallow and tight. Through the kitchen window, she saw the frost still clinging to the fields, the trees standing like watchmen. That morning she realized she had stepped into a house where silence ruled, and each person wore their fear like a heavy, invisible coat. She began to listen to the house at night. Each floorboard had its own voice, long groans, sharp cracks, small sighs that drifted through the walls like whispered threats. When the wind rose, she felt it push against the logs, the whole structure creaking as if it might buckle under its own secrets. In the darkness, she heard the western wing door slam once, then nothing but silence, so heavy it felt like a weight on her chest. Another night, a thin, broken cry slipped into the hallway, barely more than a breath. She sat up, her hands gripping the blanket, eyes wide in the dark. The sound vanished as quickly as it came, leaving her heart racing into her throat. During the day, she noticed small things: a dark stain on the edge of the cellar door, scratches on the hallway walls that looked like fingernail marks. A heavy lock always bolted the cellar shut, even when no one seemed to go near it. She asked the maid once, her voice small, "What's down there?" The woman flinched so violently the ladle fell from her hand, clattering across the floor. Without answering, she picked it up, turned her back, and resumed stirring the pot as though nothing had happened. The tall man moved through the house like a silent spectre, each step measured and heavy. He never looked at her fully, only flicked his eyes across her face like a knife slicing cloth. She began to understand that each shadow held a warning, each corner a story she was not meant to know. Every wall seemed to lean in, listening. By the time night returned, she had stopped asking questions. Her mind replayed that single distant cry again and again, as if it were a ghost pressing its cold lips against her ear. It happened on a gray afternoon, the sky pressed low against the hills. She had finished folding linens in her small room when she heard the front door creak. A sudden boldness rose inside her, a thin, quivering flame that felt almost foreign. She stepped into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wooden boards. The house was still. The maid was in the kitchen. She could hear a faint clatter. The man's boots were nowhere to be heard. She moved toward the back door, her breath caught halfway in her throat. Her fingers brushed the latch, the cold metal biting her skin. For a moment, she imagined stepping outside, feeling the sharp air fill her lungs, seeing the line of pines split open before her. But then, his hand closed around her wrist, iron-hard, unyielding. She gasped, turning to meet his eyes. They were pale and empty, as if he were looking through her rather than at her. He didn't shout. He didn't say a word. He pulled her forward, his grip grinding her bones together. She stumbled after him, her free hand clawing at his sleeve, but he didn't slow. He dragged her into her room, shoved her toward the bed. She fell hard, the breath knocked out of her lungs. The bonnet slipped from her fingers and landed on the floor, limp and useless. The door slammed shut. A heavy click followed, the lock sliding into place, final and cold. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her wrist throbbing where his fingers had bruised her skin. A thin line of pain pulsed up her arm and spread into her chest. Outside her door, the house exhaled. Boards shifted and settled as though swallowing her small act of defiance whole. That evening she didn't eat. She pressed her forehead to the wall, each heartbeat echoing like a drum against the wood, reminding her of the price of a single step. Before the first light, she woke with a start. Her wrist still burned from his grip, but something inside her pulsed harder than the pain. A sharp, desperate urge that felt like a final heartbeat before drowning. She dressed quickly, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. Her bonnet, torn and wrinkled, lay on the floor where it had fallen. She picked it up and tied it under her chin, her fingers fumbling. The hallway lay in darkness, but she could feel the house breathing around her. She moved past the kitchen, past the silent walls that seemed to hold their breath with her. At the main door, she paused. Her hand trembled on the latch. The cold air pushed through the crack, biting at her skin. She pulled the door open just enough to see the outline of the yard, the gate beyond it hanging slightly ajar in the gray dawn mist. She stepped forward, one foot on the threshold. Her breath steamed in the air, the cold slicing her throat. She looked at the trees, at the open gate, at freedom. Then a sudden weight crashed onto her shoulder. His hand, heavy, final. She spun, eyes wide. He stood above her, still in his long coat, his face like a pale stone. His other hand reached for her bonnet, ripping it from her head. The tie snapped, the fabric tearing in two jagged pieces. She let out a sharp gasp, but no words formed. He held the bonnet pieces in front of her face, then turned and walked into the house without a sound. She followed, numb, each step echoing louder than her own heartbeat. In the kitchen, he dropped the torn bonnet on the table before her. A silent sentence. She sat alone, the bonnet pieces spread like a broken promise. That morning, she ate in silence, her hands trembling around each spoonful. Each bite felt like swallowing stones. When she looked at the bonnet pieces again, she knew it wasn't just cloth he had taken. It was the last fragile layer of herself she had tried to hold on to. That night, long after the lamps were snuffed out and the wind had settled into a low, steady hum, she lay curled on her bed, her eyes burning in the darkness. Each breath felt sharp, scraping her ribs from the inside. Unable to sleep, she reached down to tuck her shawl tighter, and her fingers brushed something cold beneath the bed. Startled, she pulled her hand back, heart hammering. After a long moment, curiosity won over fear. She slid to the floor, her fingers groping in the narrow space. Her nails scraped wood, a loose floorboard. She worked her fingers under the edge, breath shallow, until it lifted with a faint crack. Inside the dark hollow lay a small locket, dull with dust, its thin chain coiled like a sleeping snake. She pulled it out, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped it. She flipped it open. Inside, a tiny hand-drawn portrait of a young woman, soft eyes, faint smile. A name was scratched into the inner lid, a name she didn't recognize. Her throat closed around a sudden rush of questions. Who was she? What happened to her? The widow pressed the locket to her palm, feeling its weight as if it held an entire life inside. The wood of the floorboard seemed to breathe under her knees, as though the house itself watched her discovery. She looked around the room, shadows thick in the corners. The thought clawed at her mind. She was not the first. With trembling fingers, she closed the locket and hid it inside her dress, close to her heart. Her pulse drummed against it, an echo of the unnamed woman's silent story. That night, she didn't sleep. The locket's cold metal pressed into her skin, each beat of her heart sounding like a distant knock on a locked door. At dusk, he called her outside. The air was sharp, the sky a darkening bruise above the ridge. She stepped onto the yard, the frozen earth cracking under her feet. Behind the barn, a fire crackled, its orange tongues reaching for the sky. Smoke rose in thick columns, stinging her eyes before she even reached it. He stood beside the flames, still and watchful, a dark silhouette against the red glow. At his feet lay a small pile, her folded dresses, a few hairpins, a thin wool scarf. every piece she had carried up that mountain trail. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her throat felt sewn shut. One by one he picked up each item and tossed it into the fire. The fabric curled, blackened, vanished into ash. The scarf twisted as if trying to flee before it crumbled in the heat. She took a step forward, hand outstretched, but he turned to her with a sharp, final look. Her feet stopped. Her hand fell to her side. The heat of the fire licked her face, beads of sweat gathering at her hairline. The smell of burning wool and cotton filled her nose, thick and sickening. He didn't speak. The only sound was the crack of the wood, the quiet hiss of cloth surrendering to flame. When the last piece turned to glowing fragments, he stepped back, brushing ash from his sleeve. He looked at her one last time, his eyes hollow and distant, before turning and disappearing into the dark yard. She stood alone before the dying fire, her breath ragged, her hands trembling so hard she thought they might break. In the charred remains, she saw the final severing of her past. Each dress, each small token, a memory turned to smoke. Long after the flames went silent, she remained there, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers, her mind echoing with the sound of things she could no longer touch. The next morning, her body felt heavy, as if each limb had been filled with stone. She moved through the kitchen like a shadow, her eyes locked to the floor, her fingers numb and clumsy around the wooden spoon. While the maid bent over the hearth, stirring the thin morning porridge, the widow noticed a corner of burlap peeking out from behind a tall sack of flour. Something inside her stirred, the same sharp pulse that had pushed her toward the door days before. She stepped closer, glancing over her shoulder. The maid kept her back turned, her bony shoulders shaking with each motion. Carefully, the widow tugged at the burlap. Behind it, an old ledger lay hidden, its leather cover cracked and smudged with dark fingerprints. She opened it, each page whispering in protest. Names, dozens of them, each carefully written in a thin, elegant hand, each line ending with a date, and every name crossed out with a single sharp stroke. Some bore red smears beside the dates, like an afterthought or a warning. Her eyes darted down the list, her breath catching when she saw the last entry. Her own name, written clearly, untouched by a line. Her hand flew to her mouth to stop a cry from escaping. The book trembled in her grip, a living thing pulsing with all the voices of the names inside. Her vision blurred. She staggered backward, hitting the edge of the table. A wooden bowl clattered to the floor, and the maid turned sharply. Their eyes met, the maid's wide with a mix of terror and something that looked like sorrow. The widow dropped the ledger. It landed with a heavy thud, pages splaying open on the dirt-smeared floor. Her knees buckled. She fell to the ground, her fingers clawing at the floorboards as if she might slip through them and vanish. Her chest rose and fell in jagged, shallow bursts, each breath sharper than the last. The kitchen felt smaller now, the walls creeping closer, the ceiling lowering with each heartbeat. She pressed her forehead against the cold wood, her mind spiraling around the list, around the ink, around the empty line waiting for her. She stayed on the floor, forehead pressed to the wood, until the air felt too thin to breathe. The ledger lay open beside her, the pages fluttering slightly with each draft from the chimney. After what felt like hours, she lifted her head. The maid still stood by the hearth, her hands gripping the sides of her apron so tightly the knuckles glowed white. Their eyes met again, this time longer, a wordless tunnel between them. The maid's lips parted as if to speak, but she swallowed the words. Her eyes flicked to the ledger, then back to the widow, and something shifted in her face. A tremor, a soft crack in her mask. She turned away abruptly, shoulders hunching as though struck. With trembling hands, she began stirring the pot again, but her movements were jerky and uneven, the spoon scraping the pot's edge like a blade on bone. The widow forced herself to her feet, clutching the edge of the table. She stepped forward slowly, each footfall echoing in her skull. When she reached the ledger, she bent down and snapped it shut. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. She looked up again. The maid had frozen mid-motion, the spoon hanging over the pot, dripping thin broth back into the steam. In that moment she understood. The maid knew about the names, the screams, the stains on the cellar door. She had known all along. The widow wanted to speak, to ask what had happened to the others, to ask if escape was possible. But the questions died in her mouth. Instead, she watched the maid's shoulders tremble, saw the way her fingers tightened as if gripping invisible bars. Finally, without turning, the maid placed the spoon on the table, her hands dropping to her sides in silent defeat. That night, as the widow lay in her bed, she thought of the ledger, the names, the empty line waiting for her. But she also thought of the maid's eyes, not cruel, not complicit, but trapped. A mirror of her own. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the frantic beat beneath her skin, each thump a silent vow. She would not become another line to be crossed out. The next day crawled by like a wounded animal, each hour bleeding into the next. She moved through her chores in silence, her mind echoing with the ledger's names and the hollow spaces between them. That evening, the sky turned a dark, aching purple, the wind carrying sharp flecks of ice against the window panes. She heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, hesitant. The maid appeared in her doorway, a dim candle trembling in her hand. The flickering light painted deep lines across her face, making her look older, more fragile. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. The widow's hands tightened around the edge of the blanket in her lap. The maid stepped closer, her breath shaking. She opened her mouth once, twice, but nothing came. Finally, she leaned forward until her lips were almost at the widow's ear. Her voice came out as a thin thread of sound, barely a breath. "Leave before the gathering. You must." The words sliced through the room like a blade. The widow's eyes widened, her mouth opening in a silent question. But the maid had already pulled back. Their eyes locked again. In the maid's gaze, she saw terror, urgency, and something deeper. A last, desperate mercy. The maid straightened, pressing the candle into the widow's trembling hand. Then she turned and slipped away into the darkness of the hallway, her thin figure swallowed by the shadows before the widow could find words. The candle flickered wildly in her grasp, its small flame a fragile, desperate heartbeat. She sat frozen, the words pounding in her skull. Leave before the gathering. Beyond the window, the forest bent under the wind, branches clawing at the sky. In that moment, the house no longer felt like walls and wood. It felt like a cage, tightening with every second she stayed. She pressed the candle to her chest, her breath uneven, the echo of the maid's whisper coiling around her like a noose she knew she had to cut herself free from. Soon, when the house finally fell into its heavy nighttime silence, she sat on the edge of her bed, the candle burned down to a stub in her shaking hand. Her heart thudded so loud it drowned out the wind rattling against the window. She rose carefully, each movement deliberate and slow, as if the walls themselves might wake and scream. She opened the small chest at the foot of her bed, what little remained after the fire. A thin wool shawl, a pair of worn boots with cracked soles, and the locket she had hidden under her dress. She packed them quietly, fingers stiff and cold. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress to tie the bundle, her breathing shallow as if the air itself were rationed. On the table she left the broken bonnet pieces, a final silent refusal to belong to this place any longer. She paused by the door, her hand hovering over the knob. Her mind replayed the maid's whisper, "Leave before the gathering." Each repetition felt like a drumbeat in the dark, pushing her forward. She slid open the door, the hinges sighing low and tired. She stepped into the hallway, her boots dangling from her fingers. Barefoot, she felt each nail and splinter in the floor, a map of pain guiding her through the dark. In the kitchen, she grabbed a stale piece of bread, slipping it into her pocket. The small knife from the counter joined it, the metal cold and solid against her thigh. The house felt alive behind her, each creak and draft a breath on her neck. As she neared the front door, she paused, head bowed. She tied her hair back in a tight knot, each pull a vow. One for the names in the ledger, one for the locket, one for the voice she still carried somewhere deep inside her. She closed her eyes, letting the fear crash through her like a storm, then forced her hand forward, fingers wrapping around the latch. Beyond the door waited the forest, the sharp cold and the unknown. But here, behind her, only silence and a waiting line in the ledger. With a final breath, she pushed the door open, the night rushing in like a wild animal. She stepped out, her boots still in hand, her feet striking the frozen earth. Each step a small, trembling rebellion against everything that had held her captive. She moved through the yard like a ghost, each breath hanging in the frozen air. The bundle pressed tight to her ribs, her bare feet stabbing into the icy ground with every hurried step. The barn loomed dark to her right, the trees just beyond, freedom just beyond. She reached the front gate and dropped to her knees, fumbling to pull on her cracked boots. Her fingers felt thick and clumsy, the laces slipping again and again. She heard her own pulse echoing in her head, louder than the wind. Then, a sound behind her. The faintest crunch of frost, too deliberate to be the wind. She looked up. He stood at the doorway, half-shadowed, as though the dark itself held him upright. His coat fell around him like a shroud, his hands hanging limp at his sides. In the glow from the open door behind him, his face looked even more hollow, more endless. She froze, the bootlace still twisted between her fingers. Slowly, he stepped forward. Each footfall measured, heavy, the snow crunching like breaking bones. She staggered to her feet, backing toward the fence, her shoulders hitting the wooden rail. Her breath fractured into short, ragged gasps. He stopped a few steps away, close enough that she could see the pale veins under his thin skin, the slow flare of his nostrils as he breathed. His eyes didn't move over her. They pinned her, held her like a nail through soft cloth. She glanced sideways at the trail beyond the gate, then back to him. Her body quivered with a silent question. Run or surrender? He took another step. She flinched, her heel catching on a patch of ice, nearly sending her sprawling. She clung to the rail, her knees ready to buckle. The cold stung her face, but his stare was colder. No words, no commands, only the heavy certainty of what would come next if she failed to act. For a heartbeat, time seemed to vanish. Just his breath, her trembling hands, and the endless black behind him. She felt the knife in her pocket, a thin line of cold metal against her thigh, a fragile promise waiting to be claimed. In that split second, she felt the entire house behind him, the cellar, the ledger, the cries at night, pressing forward like a wave about to break. Her fingers shot to her pocket. She pulled the small knife free, the blade glinting faintly under the moon. His eyes followed the motion, but he didn't step back. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if curious, as if daring her to try. Her breath came in hot, shallow bursts, clouding the air between them. Her knuckles whitened around the handle. Then she saw it. The lantern hanging on a low post near the gate, its glass catching a stray draught of wind. Without thinking, she lunged. Her hand snatched the lantern, swinging it wide. The sudden movement startled him, a flicker of surprise flashing across his pale face. She swung hard. The lantern shattered against his jaw, a sharp crack splitting the night. Oil splashed across his coat, flames licking up in an instant. His scream tore through the yard, a sound raw and inhuman. She didn't wait to see him fall. She dropped the knife, grabbed her bundle, and sprinted past him. Her boots pounded over the frozen ground, each step lighting a shock of pain up her legs. Behind her, the flames spread fast, his silhouette writhing, orange and black against the snow. Sparks drifted into the sky like frantic fireflies. She hurled herself over the fence, scraping her knees, her breath exploding in her chest. She kept running, through the gate, across the frozen yard, into the first line of trees. Branches slapped her face and tore at her hair, but she didn't slow. The cold bit at her bare skin, blood oozing from her shins and palms. Still, she ran, each heartbeat a single word. Go, go, go! The crackle of fire faded behind her, replaced by the high, whistling wind winding through the pines. She didn't dare look back. Somewhere in the dark ahead, the land fell away into the valley. She didn't know how far. She didn't care. She had broken the seal. She had made her choice. And now, every step forward was a violent, desperate prayer to reach the dawn alive. At first light, she stumbled into a clearing, her legs barely holding her upright. Frost clung to the edges of her torn dress, her hair wild and heavy with twigs. Each breath scraped her lungs, leaving a metallic taste on her tongue. She dropped to her knees, the cold earth biting into her bones. Ahead, the valley opened wide, endless fields shivering in the dawn wind, distant pines bending under the pale sky. The first sun spilled over the ridges, touching the frost with soft gold. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling the rapid animal beat beneath her palm. The locket under her dress shifted against her skin, its cold weight anchoring her to the moment. She pulled it free, staring at the small, silent portrait inside. The unknown woman's faint smile looked impossibly gentle in the morning light. Tears welled, burning hot trails down her frozen cheeks. She didn't know if they were for herself, for the woman in the locket, or for all the names in the ledger she would never hear spoken aloud. She lowered her head to the ground, forehead resting on the frozen grass, her body shaking with silent sobs. The wind moved around her, a thin, sharp whisper through the clearing. Slowly she forced herself upright. Her legs threatened to buckle, but she planted her feet wide, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Behind her, the forest loomed, the house and its burning shadow hidden now by distance and branches. Ahead lay the valley, the uncertain miles beyond. She didn't know what waited for her below, whether it was mercy, cruelty, or another set of silent rules. But in that cold, aching light, she took a step forward, then another. Every movement hurt, each breath a raw promise that she was still hers, even if broken. With the locket clutched in her fist, she descended the slope, her footprints marking a jagged, defiant line in the frost. For the first time in weeks, she felt the world open instead of close. The cost was written in every bruise, every cut, every tear sliding down her chin. But she kept going, because whatever lay ahead, it would be chosen by her feet, her hands, her will, not by a line waiting to be crossed out in a book she had left behind.